operate strong and sustainable public finances in the best interests of the people of this country.
Thank you. That concludes portfolio questions, and it brings us to the next item of business, which is the debate on motion number 8752 in the name of Neil Findlay on the NHS in Scotland. Can I invite those members who wish to participate in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now, and I indicate at this stage that we are tight for time this afternoon. I call on Neil Findlay to speak to and move the motion. Maximum 14 minutes, please.
Thanks, Presiding Officer, and can I move the motion in my name? The NHS, introduced by that radical post-war Labour government of Attlee and Bevan, is the greatest social policy ever implemented by any government. The principle of the collective payment of taxes for the universal provision of health services that are publicly owned and publicly accountable is one that I think this Parliament, and certainly the Cabinet Secretary and I, can agree on. And in that spirit of consensus that both the Cabinet Secretary and I are well known for, can I say that I think we also reject the marketisation of the NHS and the so-called reforms that are wreaking so much havoc on the NHS in England. Scottish Labour and the Scottish Government, I believe, are at one on that. Indeed, so bad are the Tory reforms that even Jackson Carlow won't endorse them. I think that indeed tells us everything about what is going on in England. And I think we could also agree on the commitment, the dedication and skill of the whole NHS workforce. Without them, the NHS would simply not function, and we ignore them and their concerns at our peril. But of course, Presiding Officer, health is fully devolved. Therefore, our responsibility in this Parliament is to hold ministers to account for what is going on here in Scotland. And as my motion sets out, the reality is that the NHS in Scotland and the staff who work in it are under pressure like never before. Budget pressures, fewer staff being asked to do more for less, the social care system in crisis, bed blocking, waiting times increasing, a skeleton weekend service, vacancy rates up, cases of bullying and the use of gagging clauses to silence staff up, junior doctors being left to look after up to 100 beds whilst working up to 100 hours a week, patients left on trolleys and sometimes being treated in cupboards, and only last week at the Western General, patients left on trolleys for up to 13 hours. And let's not forget Scotland's shame of health inequality, increasing despite the rhetoric of the Scottish Government, unsurprising given the £1 billion of cuts to anti-poverty initiatives. In the summer, I called for a full-scale review of the NHS in Scotland, and this call was not based on a whim or for narrow party political reasons. It followed wide-ranging discussions I had had with doctors, consultants, nurses, patients, trade unions and a range of stakeholders from across the NHS. The evidence they presented convinced me that we need to look at the whole system to ensure that the NHS is fit to meet the needs and demands of the 21st century. And we need such a review to examine how we sustainably finance and resource the NHS. We need such a review to ensure we have the right people in the right places to meet growing demands and expectations on health services. And we need such a review to address the challenges, but also the opportunities of an ageing population. So, let's look at some of the evidence to support this call. Caroline Gardner, the Auditor-General, told the Public Audit Committee about the hidden waiting times scandal. And remember, this was the hidden waiting time scandal that Nicola Sturgeon said didn't exist. Ms Gardner said that the focus of attention during 2011 for both the Scottish Government and the NHS was on whether the 18-week treatment target time was being achieved, rather than how it was being achieved. And that information should have rung alarm bells. And those in charge of the health service at the time, Caroline Gardner also said the NHS budget was on an amber warning, and now we see our organisation highlighting how only 3 health boards met the 12-week legal treatment time guarantee, and with 9 of the 14 failing to meet the A&E target. And in their most recent report, they said that in 2012-13 pressure had increased and the health service was focused on short-term measures, commenting The health service needs to increase its focus on longer-term financial planning so that it is prepared for the challenges it faces. Dr Brian Keithley of the BMA said in October, NHS managers have the unenviable task of managing shrinking budgets whilst trying to achieve a range of annual targets, outcomes and performance standards that are set by the government. This leaves boards focusing on planning services for the short term, making savings from easy targets such as the workforce. And he said this is not sustainable. Teresa Fife of the RCN said the Audit Scotland report paints a picture of an NHS that is doing its best whilst, and listen to this, creaking at the seams. Next year's budget doesn't look set to change much in practice. It is not sustainable to manage the health service in this way, as shown all too clearly by missed waiting time targets, growing vacancy rates for nurses and other healthcare staff, and an increasing reliance on bank and agency staff, as well as the private sector. Sir.
Mark MacDonald.
Grateful to the member for giving way. As a previous member of the Health Committee, at a number of Health Committee meetings, the question has often been asked as to where disinvestment should take place to allow for further investment in the areas that Mr Findlay has highlighted as groups recognising. Does Mr Findlay have any suggestions? Because often none are forthcoming.
Neil Findlay.
I think Mr MacDonald makes my argument for me. That is why we need an overall review of the NHS to look at these very, very issues. And Teresa Fife is absolutely right. Private sector spend up by a quarter. The use of consultants on triple time up. The use of agency nurses up by 62%. Spending on bank staff up by 15%. And vacancy rates for consultants at 4.5%. And as consultant Simon Barker of the BMA said, medical staff are working over and above what is expected of them, and they are feeling under considerable strain as a result. Clearly, this is not sustainable. These are his words. These are the words of these different groups. They are not my words. Therefore, I think we have a duty to listen. And we can see these pressures in the increase in sick days. Only in the last few days, this has come to light, the amount of sick days being taken. In Tayside, showing 24.5% of all sick days are related to stress at work. 16% in Fife and 14% in Lanarkshire. And then, of course, before Christmas, we were reminded of the tragic death of Dr Lauren Conley, who died in an accident, having worked excessive hours in the week prior to her death. We cannot treat young people who are the future of our NHS like this. That is why I have called on the Health and Safety Executive to examine junior doctor hours, and I hope the Cabinet Secretary will support that call. Junior doctors are often being asked to work 100 hours a week. That is clearly unhealthy for them and unhealthy for their patients. And I know we will talk about averaging out the working time directive and all the rest of it, but if you are there for 90 or 100 hours in that week, you cannot function properly and you cannot deal with your patients properly. And what about the Cabinet Secretary's claim that the NHS is moving to 24/7 working? Well, the Freedom of Information request recently returned from some health boards across Scotland, and we're waiting for more to come, showed that in Forth Valley, for example, allied health professional staff, that's physios, OTs and the rest, during the week, 553 allied health professionals working, 40 at the weekend. In Fife, 2,043 nurses working during the week, 648 at the weekend. And in Lothian, over 1,100 medical staff working on weekdays, yet only 25 working at the weekend. Does the Cabinet Secretary believe that these staffing numbers support his theory that the NHS is a 24/7 service? And of course we had the report into NHS Lanarkshire, covering his own constituency, a service said to be in a state of perpetual crisis. This will no doubt be covered by some of my Lanarkshire colleagues in the debate. But speaking of that report, Dr Neil Dewhurst of the Royal College of Physicians said the findings of this review make depressing but not surprising reading. Clinicians across Scotland will recognise the challenges facing colleagues in Lanarkshire. Doctors and nurses working under severe pressure with rising numbers of patients treated by a workforce with high locum levels and local recruitment difficulties. In social care, we see in Edinburgh 15% of the places in private care homes unavailable because of concerns about the level of care being provided, with a knock-on effect of over 100 patients waiting in hospital to be discharged, but no place for them. In home care, we see a sector based on the minimum wage, where contracts are driven down to the lowest levels, with training, wages and care visits cut to the bone. Visits now, in some areas, down to as little as 7 minutes, according to Age Scotland. Presiding Officer, this is not world-leading social care as claimed in the White Paper. This is not a system providing care and dignity in old age. This is a system that is failing our elderly and vulnerable people, and also failing the staff who want to provide good care. Presiding Officer, like many people, I have family and friends working in the NHS, and I know the pressures people are under. I also know the extent to which many of our staff go way beyond the call of duty to help patients. But it is those very same staff that are the most vocal and most concerned about what is going on. They are desperate to provide the care that they have been trained for. Now, the Cabinet Secretary has a choice. He either ignores those informed voices, or he acts now and instructs a wide-ranging review of the health and social care system. To date, as these voices have grown louder, the Cabinet Secretary's response appears to be to stick his fingers deeper into his ears. This simply is not good enough. Our NHS needs to be staffed properly. It needs to be managed effectively. And people and stakeholders need to have confidence in it. For the sake of our best-loved public service, I appeal to the Cabinet Secretary to initiate that review today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Alex Neil to speak to and move Amendment 8752.3. Cabinet Secretary, 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Deputy Presiding Officer. I move the amendment in my name. I have to say, a colleague of Neil Findlay's told me after he had been appointed as health spokesperson for the Labour Party that Mr Findlay had told him that he didn't know why he had been appointed to this portfolio because he knew nothing about it. I think the speech you just made underlines the veracity of that claim, quite frankly. I mean, of all the... No, not at the moment. In the 15 years I've been in this Parliament, I have to say the motion before us today is one of the most lazy, vacuous motions I've ever seen from any opposition party. To call for a review is the cry of a man in a party with no policy, no plans, no ideas and absolutely no vision. The reality of the National Health and Social Care system in Scotland today does clearly have pressures, but it isn't the basket case outlined by Mr Findlay, far from it. And if I may, I will later, can I say, Presiding Officer, the irony of calling for a review is that any time there's been a review of any aspect of policy, the Labour Party has not made any oral or written evidence to it. And the classic example is the Access to Medicines review we had last year. The Conservative Party contributed both orally and in writing with ideas on access to medicines. We had absolutely nothing from the leadership of the Labour Party. And the same is true of every other review being undertaken by the National Health Service in Scotland. So to call for a review, to call for a review is absolutely absurd. Indeed, the major review the Labour Party had was the care review that led to the proposals to close the Monklands and Ayr accident and emergency units. And the member talks about Lanarkshire. What kind of pressures would have been on Lanarkshire had Monklands A and E been closed as intended by them? But can I say, Presiding Officer, that I don't mind criticism, and I could be the first to outline the pressures on the National Health Service and the Social Care Service. But can I say that criticism based on lack of facts or on claiming things that are not true is not the way to criticise, of course.
Earlier this week on Good Morning Scotland, I heard the Labour candidate in the Cowdenbeath by-election saying that he has a hospital in the constituency that runs from one crisis to the next. And he said he had repeatedly written to the Health Minister. Can you confirm that's the position?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding, I heard that review given by Councillor Alec Rowley, the Labour candidate in Cowdenbeath, earlier this week in Good Morning Scotland, where he claimed that he had repeatedly written to me about the Victoria Hospital in Kirkcaldy. Can I say, Presiding Officer, that is not true. In fact, I have double-checked not just with my office, but with Councillor Rowley's office, and since I was appointed to this job 16 months ago, I have not received one letter from Councillor Riley in all that time. So, like his colleague Neil Findlay, he makes it up as he goes along. In November, I will now.
Neil Findlay.
The Minister said that my call for a review was absurd. Does that mean that the RCN is absurd? Does that mean that the Chartered Institute of Physiotherapists are absurd? Does that mean that the calls for change from the BMA in their New Year message are all absurd? Or is it only me that's absurd?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I say that what is required and what is demanded by the RCN and all these other organisations is action, including the 2020 action plan that we have for the future of the National Health Service. But let me say, for example, Mr Findlay makes selective quotations from a range of people. He also comes to this chamber with allegations that are not true. On the 26th of November, he told this chamber that there had been somebody in, I think it was St John's, that had been in a trolley for 18 hours. I double-checked. It was not true.
Cabinet Secretary, I'm afraid you'll have to resume your seat. Point of order, Mr Findlay.
When we come to this chamber, we should have the correct information. The Cabinet Secretary has said something that is absolutely wrong. So therefore, will you provide an opportunity for him to return to the chamber to correct the record later on?
Can I Cabinet Secretary, before you resume your feet, can I just point out again to the chamber that I have said in the past that points of order should be made at the end of speeches unless they're absolutely imperative in the middle of speeches. It's not a point of order what the Cabinet Secretary says within the context of his speech. Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, not only is that the wrong information, he put out a press release yesterday saying that budgets had been cut. The budget for the National Health Service has increased by 27% under the SNP government. We have not cut the budget for the National Health Service. The only people who were going to cut the budget was the Labour Party, because they would not commit, like their friends in Wales, would not commit to passing on the consequentials to the National Health Service in Scotland. So I think anything that Mr Findlay says and any claims he makes have to be treated with a great deal of caution, because much of what he says is just factually incorrect or inaccurate. Now, let me look at what we are doing in the National Health Service in Scotland, and let me say, we have a 2020 vision. We have stated clearly what our plan is in terms of a route map to the 2020 vision. We have a 2020 advisory board to develop the detail of that route map in every area. We know the way forward. We also know the problems. We understand the problems and the challenges. And I would say, Presiding Officer, we know what needs to be done, informed by the RCN, the BMA and a range of other organisations about what needs to be done. So let me give some facts about what we are doing with the National Health Service in Scotland. First of all, in terms of the budget, the funding increase for the territorial boards this year is 3.3%, 3.1% next year and 2.7% the year after. You could not call that a budget cut. And I've been looking and comparing the increase in the budget with the increase in the throughput of patients through the National Health Service since we came to power. Since we came to power, there has been a 3.7% increase in the number of outpatients per year. There has been an 8.9% increase in the number of inpatients per year. There has been a 2.8% increase in accident and emergency presentations per year. There's been a 9.3% increase in GP attendance, not one of those figures in excess of 10%, but during that time, we have increased the budget by 27%, nearly 3 times the average increase in the throughput through the National Health Service. Therefore, by definition, we are spending much more on our patients per head today, as well as overall, than the Labour Party was spending when they were in power. And if you look at the staffing situation, totally ignored by the Labour Party, the number of medical consultants has risen by 28%, the number of qualified nurses by 2.7%. The ratio of beds to 1,000 of a population is 2.4 compared to England's 2, and indeed a much lower rate in Wales. When you look at patient safety, there has been a 23% reduction in surgical mortalities. There has been a 12.4% reduction in hospital standardised mortality rates. Of the 31 hospitals participating in the acute patient safety programme, 10 have already achieved a reduction in HSMR in excess of 15%, with 3 already showing a reduction in excess of 20%. And Scotland's hospitals are far cleaner than they were under Andy Kerr. Cases of C. diff in patients aged 65 and over have reduced by 80.5% since they were in power. And for MRSA cases, they have reduced by 88.9% in NHS Lanarkshire, for example, and 88.4% nationally. And of course, we've also made significant reductions in premature mortality from cancer, heart disease and stroke through a number of initiatives. In unscheduled care, we are now, based on the latest figures, got 95% of people being treated and discharged within 4 hours. When you look at the performance elsewhere, in Wales, the comparable figure under Labour there is 89%. We have reduced waiting times dramatically, both for inpatients and outpatients. The time of referral to treatment has been dramatically reduced. The time people have to wait for diagnostic tests has been reduced dramatically. There are no hidden waiting lists. He quotes Carol Gardner as referring to hidden waiting lists. Nowhere does the Auditor-General refer to hidden waiting lists under the SNP.
Cabinet Secretary, I've given some allowance for the point of order, but I really need you to draw to a close now, please.
I will do. And finally, in terms of our workforce is rising not just in numbers but in skills levels, and we are treating our workforce properly and dealing with any problems of harassment or bullying, which I have said we take a zero-tolerance approach to. So all in all, Presiding Officer, of course there are problems, of course there are pressure points, but instead of exploiting them and turning a small number of cases into a large national crisis, look at the patient survey and the satisfaction rate of nearly 90%. I can tell you it's a far higher satisfaction rate than the Labour Party has had for the last 10 years.
Thank you. I'm afraid if members don't keep to the times given, then we will lose a member from this debate. I now call on Jim Hume to speak to and move Amendment 8752.1. 6 minutes, please, Mr Hume.
Thanks, Presiding Officer, and I move the amendment in my name and welcome the opportunity to contribute to this afternoon's debate. The Labour Party motion describes the NHS as the country's most valued and loved public service. That's a statement I wholeheartedly endorse. And I also associate myself with the Cabinet Secretary's Christmas message, where he spoke of the extraordinary work undertaken by NHS staff across Scotland on a daily basis to improve the lives of others. NHS staff are the lifeblood of the health service, and just as we look upon them to ensure our welfare in our time of need, they rely on us to ensure their welfare is taken care of as well. But the reality is that many frontline staff are under extreme pressure Just last month, the BMA Chairman, Dr Brian Keeley, warned us that reports of stress and burnout amongst all grades of clinical staff are now emerging across the service. This followed the RCN 2013 employment survey published early December, which also made for alarming reading. It revealed that 54% of Scotland nurses were working more than their contracted weekly hours, with much of the overtime going unpaid. 58% reported being under too much pressure, and this should really keep the Cabinet Secretary up at night. 55% believe that they are unable to provide the standards of care that they would like to due to this pressure. When you continue to pile pressure on any employee, then corners may inevitably be cut. That might be tolerable in many professions, but when decisions and actions can mean life and death, then corner cutting simply can't be tolerated. We only have to look at Lanarkshire, as mentioned before, to see why the Cabinet Secretary should be, and I'm sure he is, straining every sinew to support the majority of nurses who believe they cannot provide the standards of care they want. Health Improvement Scotland were moved to make 21 recommendations following their discovery of poor working conditions, inadequate staffing, delays in admitting emergency patients and patients not being listened to. And while no definitive conclusions could be drawn, it's telling that quality of care couldn't be rolled out as a factor behind the unusually high mortality rates. At this point, I must take issue with a specific part of the Cabinet Secretary's amendment. In it, he praises the Scottish Patient Safety Programme and the role it plays in Scotland's hospitals. I don't contest that point, but I refer him to the Health Improvement Scotland's report into NHS Lanarkshire, which stated that the review team found that awareness of the Scottish Patient Safety Programme was low in the majority of areas it visited, with little evidence that staff were consistently applying improvement techniques. Although there were exceptions, of course, some elements of the programme, specifically executive safety walkarounds, are not in place, and other key patient safety interventions need to be reliably implemented, unquote. So I presume it will be some concern to the Cabinet Secretary not only are there some elements of his world-leading patient safety programme not being implemented, and that some staff are not even aware of its existence. The Cabinet Secretary must ensure that this particular finding is exclusive to NHS Lanarkshire and not widespread throughout the NHS. These pressures staff face are born out of many things: the expectations placed upon staff by government, of course, but staffing bottlenecks in certain wards, in certain hospitals, in certain specialities across Scotland also contribute. The latest NHS workforce statistics up to September 2013 reveal a significant increase in both consultant, nursing and midwifery vacancies. In just 12 months, there are an additional 70 consultant posts lying empty, double what they were in September 2012, and with a 26% increase in the number of posts which had been lying empty for over 6 months. In that same period, there's been a 28% increase in the number of nursing and midwifery vacancies, with nearly 1,400 posts lying empty, and a 27% increase in those empty for over 6 months. The recruitment issues at the BMA and Royal College of Nursing continue to warn us should be one of the Cabinet Secretary's main priorities. On that point, yeah.
Has the member had an opportunity to look at what Unison Scotland have said when they said we are pleased that the Scottish Government have listened to Unison and that as a result we will train more nurses in 2014?
I am very aware of that, and I'll actually come to that point in my summing up. And I recognise it's not the whole NHS is broke here, but there are parts of it that do need priority. Invariably, there's been a knock-on effect on NHS ability to provide treatment in a timely fashion also. I've highlighted this in the Chamber before, the disparity in treatment times for cancers, not only in different health boards, but by cancer type, and make no apology for doing so again. In the most recent stats, 95% standard was only achieved in 3 of the 10 cancer types. Nationally, 9.1% of cervical patients, 9.6% of screened colorectal patients, 10.1% of urological patients and 13.4% of head, neck and patients had to wait over the 62 days for their first treatment. And 8% of those head and neck patients had to wait upwards of 84 days for their first treatment. Presiding Officer, I believe my amendment today is a constructive one. I do have issues regarding the Labour motion as well, as did Alex Neil. I do believe that there is much the NHS do well and have the greatest respect for our hard-working staff, but there are some concerns that need addressed. But I don't believe that a full and costly comprehensive review is what resources should be focused on. I'd rather money went to hard-working nurses rather than expensive reviews, and the Cabinet Secretary concentrate on where we need to make our improvements. Thank you.
Thank you. Now call on Jackson Carla. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, this is the midpoint just of this Parliament, and on such a fundamental issue already devolved in its entirety this place, we believe and have ourselves argued that the time is right to set the we did, we built, we spent, you cut, we opened, you closed mentality, all too prevalent between the two larger parties when debating health matters, decisively to one side. This is the time when, free of national elections, we can collectively look objectively at the plans we require to make to secure Scotland's health service in the future, and in the face of all the demographic and other challenges which could all too easily overwhelm it if left to chance and fortune. Now, there are two halves to this debate, the now and the hereafter. So let me say, as we enter 2014, that we look forward in the immediate months ahead to the resolution and reporting back of recent actions and initiatives. We are especially interested to establish the outcome of the discussions and plans being made in conjunction with the SMC, which will afford greater access to new medicines, and particularly to new cancer medicines. And I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary's actions on this matter, and I know we will be meeting in early course to hear what practical actions will follow. We look forward with keen attention to the outcome of the consultation on the future treatment of chronic pain. We note that in May it will be 2 years since we offered our support to the Government for its minimum unit pricing legislation, but we remain no clearer now as to when and indeed if the Government believes this legislation will be enacted. Meanwhile, we urge the Government to look afresh at proposals from Richard Simpson and others on how we continue to tackle Scotland's relationship with alcohol. We are keen to see noises regarding universal health visiting translate into actions, to know what the benefits of the senior charge nursing programme are proving to be, and to see real encouragement in future nursing capacity. And while we welcome unreservedly the increase in nurses' training announced this week, we do so mindful of the significant and sustained increase in the demographic profile of our nurses. They are getting older and nearing retirement, and in short, we believe we are overcomplicating nursing to a point where it is proving significantly less attractive to new entrants as a career. We need to address this now. We have an ambition to make the pathways from hospital to care effective, and this and all before are just part of the sum and substance of the job currently in hand. In this, we've supported the Government constructively when we can. But, Presiding Officer, if you'll excuse me saying so, for all the Cabinet Secretary celebrated bonhomie, acknowledging and addressing the shortcomings of his predecessor is not just enough. It was the great privilege of the Labour Party to create the National Health Service. Now, at times over the years, as I listen to speeches from across the chamber, I'm left wondering if others believe that the Conservative Party was actually opposed to its establishment. We were not. Let me quote from Churchill's 1945 manifesto. We propose to create a comprehensive health service covering the whole range of medical treatment from the general practitioner to the specialist, and from the hospital to convalescence and rehabilitation, and to introduce legislation for this purpose in the new Parliament. It was Attlee's, I will end my summing up, it was Attlee's privilege, but it enjoyed Churchill's support. However, the National Health Service established then no longer exists other than in name. The Blair government substantially broke the links between the health service in England and elsewhere, and yes, the Westminster coalition government continues to do so. Some of what they or of what both did works, and we should not be afraid to acknowledge this or look at it. But the reality is that we now have substantially different health services across the United Kingdom, and what we here are entrusted to ensure is that the Scottish Health Service, by which name we should perhaps come to call it, is the best by any standard. So let me make clear again, that is to accept Scotland's wish to have a publicly funded, publicly owned, publicly run Scottish Health Service. It is not to accept all that it has done in its name, or to excuse outmoded practice, or to justify the unjustifiable. It is to accept a basis on which we can all collectively proceed. Now, it's likely, I put it no more strongly, that one of the other of the two larger parties here this afternoon will form the next devolved government of Scotland in 2016. Now, we will take account with great care as to which of them, of which between the devil and the deep blue sea, proposes the most substantial and thoughtful programme for the future development of Scotland's health service. Which is prepared to stop bragging, to stop grandstanding, and to stand instead prepared to ask difficult questions and act on the answers? Scottish Conservatives question whether the current structure of tertiary and non-tertiary health boards is sustainable or desirable. There is a case to embrace the most talented management, wherever it is to be found in Scotland's health service, and to invite those men and women to lend their talents to the whole of the health service. And by that I mean I envisage a slimmed-down board structure. If we are to meet the challenges of providing the best health service for the people of Scotland, in the face of all that we already know, then we must also more substantially beef up what we require of people in Scotland by way of their commitment to Scotland's health service. For example, it is not acceptable to routinely fail to present for clinical appointments. It is not only a waste of time and money, but a serious undermining of the opportunity for others in need. But the responsibility for all of us to our health service goes much further, and Scottish Conservatives will have more to say on this in the months ahead. Surely sterile name-calling about our respective love of Scotland's health service serves little or any purpose. Is it futile to expect we can move beyond our imaginations, our enmities and our ambitions? I hope not. Now is the time for us collectively to participate in a full and comprehensive debate, at least, of the NHS in Scotland. And I hear what the Cabinet Secretary says about reviews. They can take a long time and they can paralyse decision-making, and I have a great deal of sympathy with that. But if it is our duty not to seek ownership of health as a partisan battle cry, but to achieve nothing short of the best outcomes, the best access, the best practice, the best delivery, which both meet and beat the challenges, demographic, clinical or whatever, that lie immediately ahead, a collective plan is such a thing as possible, is surely desirable. To remember that at the heart of this are people, our people.
Thanks very much. And we now move to open debate. We're extraordinarily tight for time. Speeches up to 6 minutes, please. I'll call on Bob Doris to be followed by Michael McMahon.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I wrote down a couple of words from Jackson Carlaw's speech. He said our contributions should be substantial and thoughtful, and I think if we take that forward and with planning forward, Scotland's NHS will be in a good place as a Parliament. With respect, I genuinely don't think that's what Mr Finlay brings to the Chamber this afternoon. I would like to look at two themes with the NHS. One is about how you deal with challenges when they emerge in short order and deal with them quickly and efficiently, and how you do your long-term planning. And I think those are two aspects that the Scottish Government does well, but will also, more importantly, where we can do better, listen to specific suggestions about how we can do that better. But I didn't hear any this afternoon from the Labour Party during the opening contribution. I would like to, I was going to mention actually hidden waiting lists under Labour in 2006. Out of consensuality, let me not go down that painful road for the Labour Party. Let me move on to where the Scottish Government has found challenges within the NHS, and let's look at the issues that health boards had, particularly NHS Lothian, but others, in relation to how waiting lists and availability was recorded within Scotland. We had a pretty robust structure within this Parliament and via the audit process to suggest recommendations. And I have to say we are now in a strong position because Scotland and the Parliament acted quickly, and we now have a system of patient-advised availability and complete openness and transparency. That wasn't a review of the entire NHS. That was this Government, this Parliament and their committee system responding to the challenges that presented themselves. Can also talk about waiting times targets. We'll pick one that is good for the Government. In September 2013, our 18-week waiting time target was 90%. It was met, it was 90.9%, so we met our targets on waiting times. I have no doubt that was due to the investment, real terms increase in funding of the NHS by this Scottish Government that I don't think would have happened had another Government been in power. However, depending which waiting time you look at, targets are not always met. That's why in a few months' time, as part of the Health Committee of this Parliament, NHS boards will be in front of the Health and Sport Committee, and I will be asking them what they are doing to reprioritise their resources to meet targets where they have fallen short. Constantly under review, constantly scrutinised and constantly taking forward continuous improvement within the NHS. Just to say, let's review everything, becomes meaningless in my opinion, and I feel that's what's offered in the motion before us today. One example of where this Parliament got it right were a short an immediate issue sprang to mind is in regulation of care for older people. Nicola Sturgeon, as Cabinet Secretary at that point, listening to an inquiry by the Health and Sport Committee, moved before we had reported to address that situation. Immediate responses by this Parliament, not just a general review for the sake of a general review, or a more thoughtful one. And Jackson Carlow hinted upon it, and that's in terms of access to new medicines. Thoughtful, thought out, not just about a short-term populist soapbox reaction to access to medicines, but getting it fair and robust for the future of Scotland, our patients, for families and the NHS, not just for a couple of years, but for a generation. And I hope we'll have some fantastic news on that in the very near future. I'd like to look at staff numbers. Yeah, the staff numbers do look good for the Scottish Government. Let's just deal with the facts, not the spin. The facts are qualified nurses and midwives is up 2.7% compared to under Labour. Medical consultants up 28%, GPs up 5.5%. But will there be workload issues? Will there be issues in terms of staff management and planning? Of course there will be. That's why, for example, the Scottish Government, in conjunction with the RCN in relation to nurses, brought forward workforce and workload management tools to address these problems. And I'll look forward to something in a moment. I'll look forward to more information on how we tackle any issues elsewhere within staffing complement within the NHS, but constantly under review. It will have to be brief, Mr Finlay.
Neil Finlay. Does he recognise the comments made by Teresa Fife of the RCN, who say the Scottish Government cannot simply continue to say that the number of nurses working in the NHS is higher than it was a couple of years ago? This misses the point entirely. We need the appropriately skilled nurses working in the right places to meet the growing demand and deliver good quality care. I'm delighted you raised that, because the Scottish Government is not simply saying that. That's why there's a workload management plan as well. It's about the roles nurses are performing, not just the number of nurses, whether they're in the acute sector, whether it's planned surgery, whether it's the community. Of course it's not as straightforward as that, and I have to say the Scottish Government doesn't think it's as straightforward as that, and Mr Finlay has to start looking at the details of his brief, not just the sound bites of his brief. Very quickly, can I talk about 7-day service within the NHS? Having spoken to a lot of representatives in the medical profession, I have to say they want to reinforce there is a 7-day service already for when the NHS has to move quick in emergency situations. And I'm delighted that as part of the Scottish Government's 2020 vision and its advisory board, it is moving forward to work out how we can go further on that in a planned way, where you talk to the physiotherapists, you talk to the pharmacists, you talk to the porters, you talk to all the relevant staff, and you plan forward how you can take forward a 7-day service in the NHS in a planned method, not just a review for the sake of a review, which I think is what the Labour opposition have brought to the Chamber today. So I think there's no complacency with the Scottish Government how we manage the NHS. Lots of challenges, but we're heading forward in the right direction.
Many thanks. Now Colin Michael McMahon, to be followed by Lee MacLeod.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. This debate is a very welcome one, as it's vital that we look at what challenges the NHS in Scotland is currently facing and project forward in order to make the progress we all want for it. The NHS in Scotland may not be broken, but it's not in a good place at the present time. It's regrettable that this is the case, as Scotland cannot afford for our NHS to be doing anything other than addressing the current health needs of our people and positioning itself to face the increasing pressures that are facing it in the longer term. Whatever views are expressed in this debate, though, the one word we should not be taken with any seriousness is the word surprise. We have known for some considerable time that pressures have been growing and what these strains are. Primarily, these are demographic change and staffing difficulties. These are not new issues. They did not emerge as problems for the Scottish Government after the last election, or after even the 2007 election. There have been concerns facing the NHS throughout the devolution period and beyond. So why has it come to pass that our nursing and medical bodies are telling us today that things are as bad as they are when we knew that this was coming? So before we look forward, let us look back a few years to 2004. That was the year when, faced with the same growing demands on the NHS that confront it today, the then Health Minister Malcolm Chisholm set up the National Framework Advisory Group to consider the future shape of the NHS in Scotland. That report was delivered in 2005 and confirmed a lot of what we already knew. The NHS has a highly trained and committed staff, capable of delivering health care on a par with anywhere in the world. Our medical and nursing schools produce first-class graduates. Huge progress has been made in tackling some of Scotland's killer diseases. However, it was also apparent that we were compared badly over a range of health indicators with some of our neighbours. It concluded that we needed to transform the NHS with a series of bold initiatives which would provide a framework to deliver safe, quick and sustainable health care for the future. The report concluded that we had to put aside what is sometimes seen as narrow self-interest and pull together to reconfigure Scotland's NHS to better serve our old, our infirm, our poor and our children sick, so that at last we might cast off the label of the sick man of Europe. So when we debated that report, which became known as the Kerr report, so denigrated this afternoon by the Cabinet Secretary, in this chamber on the 27th of October 2005, it was clear that there was widespread support for it. Indeed, when opening the debate for the SNP opposition at that time, their health spokesperson, Shona Robson, stated, "If the Minister ensures implementation and delivery, he will have our full backing." In closing the debate that day, Stuart Maxwell was not concerned so much about the content of the Kerr report, but was more exercised by a fear about the then Executive's commitment to implement it. Indeed, he went so far as to say that there are underlying concerns that the proposals that are laid out in Professor Kerr's report will either not be fully implemented or will, as he said, be subjected to cherry-picking. Yet barely a year later, the SNP, and foremost amongst its members was the now Health Secretary, who began campaigning to have the Kerr report ripped up and to cherry-pick NHS board decisions that they didn't like. So while the Kerr report was all about working smarter, looking ahead and planning to prevent crisis, the short-term electoral priorities of the SNP saw it consigned to the dustbin. Be in no doubt, that is one major reason why our hospitals are in crisis today, why our nurses and doctors are under the pressure they are, and why we've had to have investigations into the increasing mortality rates in NHS Lanarkshire, and why there is such disarray in parts of the NHS. It is why, despite the warnings of the Kerr report, Audit Scotland has said the NHS is focused on short-term measures and has no long-term financial plan. That's the Audit Scotland Cabinet Secretary, and maybe you would listen to them, even if you won't listen to me. And it's the reason that the British Medical Association say that the strain on staff is unsustainable, and why the Royal College of Nursing believe that the NHS is creaking at the seams. Unison said in its response to the Kerr report that the policy of partnership developed by the Scottish Executive Health Department, the service and staff side, since 1997 is the key to successful implementation. They made it absolutely clear that the NHS of the future would require staff providing a different service in different working environments and with different skills and roles. They said we need to ensure that we make the best and the most appropriate use of our staff. Yet when it was necessary to invest in community projects to keep people out of hospital, thereby enabling health boards to save money against hospital budgets, we got obstruction to change from this government. And rather than prescribed reforms, we got petrification. When we needed a rebalancing of budgets by health boards to make the proportionate spend on primary care and community services go up, and the proportionate spend on hospitals go down, we got short-term political grandstanding in order to court popularity at the expense of progress.
And you must close
this
now,
simply
please.
Cannot be allowed to continue. That is why we need another review. We can't go back, but we have to look at how we go forward, and it would require an independent look at that, because we cannot trust this present Cabinet Secretary with the future of the NHS.
Thank you very much. Now call on Aileen MacLeod to be followed by Jane Baxter. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'm delighted to be speaking in support of the Government's amendment to the motion before the Parliament this afternoon, not least because, like many speakers in today's debate, it gives me the opportunity once more to place on the record my admiration and gratitude for the work of all of our NHS staff in attending to Scotland's public health needs in what we all acknowledge are challenging circumstances. And that is why, Presiding Officer, I was very disappointed, perhaps not surprised, when I read the motion tabled by Mr Finlay, for it implies quite clearly that the NHS in Scotland is not presently a service fit to meet the needs of Scotland's sick and infirm, nor that it is taking significant steps and implementing substantial reforms to meet the challenges ahead. I mean, yes, we know there are pressure points and we know there are challenges, but this Government is by no means complacent in its response to addressing these. Presiding Officer, the Labour motion would lead one to believe that this government was taking no measures to prepare the NHS and indeed the country as a whole for the challenges we know face our public health sector in the future. And if the Labour members of this Parliament are in any doubt about the range and ambition of these preparations, then I would urge them to seriously consider the amendment to Mr Finlay's motion tabled by the Cabinet Secretary this afternoon. And if they do so, then I think any reasonable person would concede the SNP Government's custodianship of our shared NHS in Scotland by any domestic or international metric reflects a process of ongoing reform that is ensuring that our nurses and doctors are equipped to provide the best possible care for the sick and the infirm across Scotland. And indeed, it is difficult to avoid comparisons with the situation in Wales, with the Labour Party in power, but where their progress on key targets lags behind the performance of the NHS under the SNP Government. But on a more positive note, Presiding Officer, let us consider just a few of the reforms that this Government is currently implementing to ensure that our NHS is fit for purpose as we confront what are unprecedented societal and financial challenges, at least under Westminster rule, we face in the future. I'd like to make some progress, Presiding Officer. My apologies to Mr Finlay, but I think we've had enough from Mr Finlay this afternoon. The integration of health and social care that this Government is bringing forward is a central plank in our response to the challenges of an ageing population in Scotland. Now, this has the potential, and I firmly believe will change fundamentally the capacity of the public health services of this country to respond effectively and compassionately to the complex needs of the elderly and, crucially, to improve the quality of their lives. It will also release NHS resources to ensure that we are able to deliver the quantity and quality of acute services to those in need. And under this Government, Presiding Officer, significant reforms are being implemented that will improve workload, workforce and bed planning through the series of groundbreaking mandatory planning tools that will help our health boards to plan for the number of staff and beds that they require, and also other reforms that are leading to increased efficiencies in the delivery of NHS services. And similarly, the numbers of NHS frontline staff continues to increase under this Government. There are more nurses and nursing students in the NHS today than when we took office, demonstrating this Government's commitment to increasing the capability of the NHS in the coming years. But of course, Presiding Officer, the health of the nation, and so the pressures to which our NHS must respond, is also a function of the preventative actions that we are taking to avoid citizens placing what are essentially avoidable demands on the NHS in future. And I've already mentioned the integration of health and social care in this regard, but I'd also point to other preventative actions, particularly last week's announcement that all children in primary 1 to 3 will receive free school meals. That single measure in itself will directly promote the health of our children in the all-important younger years, thereby reducing the likelihood of them succumbing to a range of medical conditions in later life, and helping us to tackle the health inequalities that continue to blight our society. Which begs the question, therefore, Presiding Officer, why Labour chose to vote against that measure last week. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I would respectively ask our Labour colleagues to reflect on the key measures that this Government has taken and is taking to ensure that our valued and trusted NHS is equipped to tackle the challenges ahead. No government, no politician owns the NHS. The NHS is owned by and works relentlessly and with extraordinary success for the people of Scotland. And I sincerely believe that this Government, the current custodian of the NHS, has a very clear strategy for managing the health and broader welfare challenges ahead, and is implementing that strategy with a focus and purpose that simply is not evident elsewhere in the UK. So I urge the Chamber this afternoon to support the amendment to the motion tabled by the Cabinet Secretary. This is not a matter of political point scoring, but it's rather the mature and responsible approach that recognises the excellent actions the Scottish Government is taking and its longer-term vision for health and social care to ensure that our NHS is equipped to successfully meet the considerable challenges ahead. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now call on Jane Baxter to be followed by Gil Patterson. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am pleased to participate in this debate today, which seeks both to recognise the value of the NHS and also the need for us to enable it to continue to meet the health needs of the people of Scotland through a thorough examination of how it functions at the moment. It goes without saying that the NHS is a hugely valued institution, which is held in high regard by people of all ages and circumstances. Indeed, we know from our own experiences, those of our families, and from the experiences of our constituents, how important a properly functioning and fit-for-purpose National Health Service is to everyone in this country. As a former elected member of NHS Fife Health Board, I am acutely aware of the challenges facing boards on a daily basis. And as an MSP, like others here today, I am equally conscious of the impact these challenges are having on people who need health services and also on those responsible for delivering those services across the country. I am sure every single member in this chamber will have a large proportion of their casework made up of constituents struggling to access the health care they need in the time or place they need. More worryingly, there will be examples of distressing circumstances where they have been let down by a service from which they should have been able to expect the utmost care and attention. Having met with the Cabinet Secretary last year to highlight the problems at the Victoria Hospital, I know he is well aware of the problems being experienced by patients and staff within NHS Fife. He will also be aware of the consistent, worrying stream of stories in the local papers across Fife from patients who have had negative experiences of both hospital and primary care provision across the Kingdom. In fact, the first two editions of the Dunfermline Press this year have highlighted on their front page stories of the pressures on staffing and the impact that this is having on patients. And the warnings from the headlines couldn't have been more stark. On the 2nd of January, in a not very happy New Year message, the paper warned readers, "Don't get sick in Fife at the weekend," as it highlighted the huge drop in staff on duty at weekends at hospitals across the Kingdom. The following week's paper didn't improve the prognosis for the Health Board much either, as we learned of a fall patient who was told, "You're lucky this didn't happen at the weekend." With that patient being told they would have had to make their way to Dundee for weekend treatment, it's clear there are major pressure points on the frontline services in Fife. And those headlines become clearer, Presiding Officer, when we discover that in Fife alone, while on weekdays the average number of clinical staff working in hospitals in Fife stands at 2,043, at the weekends this drops massively to just 648. Colleagues across the Chamber have already highlighted the huge pressures on staff, and the results from the NHS Scotland Staff Survey in 2013 and the evidence from bodies such as the Royal College of Nurses, Scotland, back up these concerns. And let me be crystal clear, no one in this debate today is suggesting that the staff in our NHS are any less than the dedicated, highly skilled professionals. But even the most talented workers in the world cannot meet all the demands expected on them if there are problems with the staffing levels in their workplace. There comes a point when the jam just won't spread any thinner. Because when the NHS's own workforce survey finds only a third of a workforce thinks that they are able to meet the demands of their job, and that even a smaller fraction think there are enough staff to enable them to do their job properly, then we know there's a serious crisis. And we know that the challenges facing our health boards are not just restricted to staffing, but extend to waiting lists, funding, bed numbers. The list goes on in Fife and across the country. In fact, the Scottish Government's own figures on delayed discharges show that NHS Fife's problems are worsening, with the numbers of people waiting more than 14 days to be discharged from hospital steadily increasing over the course of 2013. And the challenges are so great that I believe we can see the staffing pressure within the NHS beginning to creep out into areas out with the health service, such as home care and children's services. Members will be aware of the recent debates as part of the ongoing Children and Young People's Bill, where the Royal College of Nurses has estimated that an additional 450 health visitors would be needed to meet the requirements of the named person provisions within that bill. So from our youngest citizens to our eldest, the challenges remain. An ageing population and the integration of health and social care and the accompanying pressures that puts on budgets and resourcing means that now, more than ever, we need an integrated, overarching review of how our health service is able to meet the demands, not just of today, but of whatever the future awaits for us. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Now call on Gill Patterson to be followed by Nanette Milne. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. I'm very pleased to speak in this debate this afternoon. Presiding Officer, the Labour motion starts by saying that this Parliament believes that the NHS is the country's most valued and loved public service. Yet, in 2011, the Labour leader at the time said that they wouldn't ring-fence the health budget, which could leave it open to being cut by the Labour Party. This is like saying to your child, I really value you and I love you to bits, but you're getting no extra clothes for the winter. In their motion, Labour go on to call for a review of the Scottish Health Service, when they know to a person that the Scottish Health Service has been in constant review almost on a day-to-day, month-to-month basis since the SNP came to office. But maybe the review that Labour wants is a review that brings about what their London Shadow Health Minister championed, and that is a level of delivery and service that is UK-wide. God help us if we go down this road of England, the road of no return, the privatisation and the disconsent of both the providers, i.e. the workforce, and the users, the public. Or are they giving up the notion of free provision at the point of need? That might not be so fanciful a statement that I'm making when you consider Labour in action. One example of Labour in action was just last week, with the turning of their backs on preventative health spend when they voted against free school meals for primary 1 and 3 pupils. A policy which would have a positive impact on the long-term health of some of our most needy children. And this measure, because it is universal, will ensure it removes the invariable stigma and bullying that goes on when you means test and shine an unwelcome light on the poor. Removing the stigma and the bullying will also result in a significant health changes for those children we want to make the difference for, because they will participate unhindered by their richer peer group. Because this is universal, this will be much more successful and significant, and what we know is that by reaching children at early age, the health benefits are for life. Still, I find it hard to believe, even a week later, that a majority of members in the Labour benches actually believed in what they were actually being asked to do. I'll take an intervention, Mr Finlay, if you want on that point.
I think the member completely misrepresents what happened last week. He knows what we were voting on last week, but he just decides to make things up. That's nothing unusual. That's how his government works. You just make it up as you go along.
Well, the record will show that every Labour member voted against a measure to provide food for children that are in need in Scotland, and it's going to help them. It's going to help them. That's a crucial time to intervene, and it's going to help their health chances for the whole of their life. That's a fact. That's what you did. If you're saying you didn't mean it, I'll be quite honest. If you didn't actually mean it, I'll be grateful, because I'm just going to say here, but if the majority of the Labour members did and do not believe that they were right to vote against free school meals and the health benefits that go with it, then my father, a staunch Labour man, would be billing in his grave, because the legacy of the once proud Labour Party will have been trashed. On the other hand, I'm pleased that this Scottish Government acknowledges that universal services are partners to preventative spend and have shown their dedication to this through its own actions. Yes, free prescriptions save individual people money, but with the universal service of free prescriptions, the people are now able to take the full prescribed treatment and not miss out vital parts, which in turn saves millions of pounds from treating complications caused by individuals having to pick up and choose what medicine to take in order to save vital household money. which, as previously stated, damages the recovery in the process. Free eye tests ensure that disease and infections are picked up at an early, inexpensive, treatable stage, rather than the complications of the past that were caused by not being tested early, which are extremely expensive to deal with. Universal concessionary bus travel also contributes in a preventative way to the health of our nation, as it ensures our older people are mobile and out and about visiting family and friends, or just going down the coast for a trip of nostalgia. By being out of their house to visit family or friends and active, it ensures that they remain healthy in mind and in body, which cuts down on the number of visits they would have to make to hospitals, thus saving millions of pounds to the NHS and can be reinvested. What a win-win bargain. Presiding Officer, if the Labour Party is serious about their what does they call it? They call it love for the health service. Then let them put their money where their heart is and withdraw their commitment to not, and I repeat, not ring-fencing the health budget. And I support the Government's amendment, and I support the Cabinet Secretary in particular in his work in this area. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now calling Annette Milne to be followed by Roderick Campbell. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Although it frightens me to think about it, next year will see the 50th anniversary of my graduation from medical school. And my commitment to a National Health Service freely available to patients at the point of need has been unwavering throughout those 50 years, and it will not change. I became part of a profession that was paternalistic towards its patients, who were passive recipients of the care meted out to them. GPs on the whole worked on their own, their surgery often in their own home, and without the backup of the team of professionals which is essential in today's primary care setting. The hospital was run by the medical superintendent and matron, and in the wards, sister ruled supreme, whilst the consultant was often seen as a godlike figure on his daily ward round, talking over his patient's head to his retinue of junior staff and medical students in language which was unintelligible to the average patient whose diagnosis and treatment was being discussed. Today's NHS would seem like science fiction to my generation of medical graduates, thanks to the enormous advances in technology and pharmacology, which allow more and more of us to live well into old age and can either cure diseases which were once fatal, or turn them into long-term conditions, as we now see in many forms of cancer, for instance. In my own family alone, my son has lived with a transplanted liver for over 20 years, my daughter has had IVF, and I have a new hip, all unimaginable when I left medical school. So it's hardly surprising that the NHS today is struggling to cope with the enormous demands being placed on it, with staff under severe pressure as they deal with an increasing number of patients living far into old age with multiple health problems and requiring significant social as well as health care if their needs are to be properly met. Like most people, I have nothing but praise for the army of health and other professionals, and also non-professionals, who run the NHS, which is indeed our most valued and loved public service, as the Labour motion states. And there's no doubt that with rising demands on the service and increasing pressure on resources, both human and financial, these need to be carefully managed at both government and local level. But one of the great tensions in today's NHS is between management on the one hand and clinicians on the other, as they try to meet the needs of the patients for whose well-being the service exists. The BMA calls for better engagement with the medical profession to resolve some of the challenges, with Dr Keithley, its Scottish chairman, stating that rather than managerial and process change holding the solution to sustaining high-quality care, it is only by working with doctors and other healthcare professionals that a solution will be found. The RCN has been highlighting a critical shortage of nurses and midwives for some time now, and emphasises the struggle of those in post to deal with increasing workloads. The RCGP has made it plain that GPs are buckling under the strain of demands being placed on them, and AHPs have also indicated that they are too few in number to cope with the increasing demand for their services. To be fair, the Scottish Government has responded to a number of the pleas for help, and the measures outlined in its amendment today should begin to point the way to improving quality in Scotland's health and care services. Yesterday's announcement of an increased intake of student nurses starting their course this autumn is a welcome sign that Government is listening and responding to the RCN's concerns. But of course there will be a significant time lag before the current shortage of nurses in the workforce is overcome. the recent modification of the GP contract in Scotland to take out some of its bureaucracy will help to free up GPs to focus more on their patients rather than tick boxes on their computer. And if the integration of health and social care goes as planned, a new culture of cooperation between health and social care workers, between community and hospital health professionals, and with the voluntary and independent sectors should eventually lead to a seamless continuum of care for the growing number of people who depend on it. But of course, time will tell. The Government's plans to refocus the role of public health nurses and to reintroduce the titles of health visitor and school nurse are welcome and will undoubtedly be of benefit to young families in the crucially important very early years of development and beyond. So there is real optimism for the future, but there still is a very long way to go to achieve the 24/7 service fit for the 21st century, which we all aspire to. And I think my colleague Jackson Carlow, in his opening contribution, has clearly signposted how we should be approaching the future, seeking to develop our unique Scottish Health Service to meet the undoubted challenges ahead, whether or not Scotland, as I hope, will continue to be part of the United Kingdom. I worry about the difficulty in recruiting and retaining consultants in certain specialties, as we've seen recently in oncology in Grampian. I've spoken to consultants in specialties like orthopaedics, ophthalmology and mental health, who feel that their clinical managers are not heeding their expert clinical advice. And I see the crying need for more nurses, not least for specialist nurses in lung cancer, diabetes, epilepsy, asthma and a number of other conditions where their expertise is invaluable, helping to keep patients in the community and freeing up GP and consultant time to the benefit of patients and a more efficient use of scarce NHS resources. I also worry about an increasing number of justifiable complaints from patients, such as the one I heard about this week from a constituent who, following her husband's discharge from hospital at 2:30 p.m, then waited until 7 o'clock for his medication, only to be told the pharmacy was now closed and she'd have to return the next day to get his prescription. Surely no way to treat a couple in their late 80s. Presiding Officer, I conclude by welcoming this debate brought by Scottish Labour, because I think it's good that we discuss what's going well in the NHS and what requires improvement. And it also gives us the opportunity to acknowledge the hard work of all those involved in the NHS and to thank them for their unfailing dedication to the patients they serve. Thank you.
Well done. Now call on Roderick Campbell to be followed by Hugh Henry.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. May I begin, like Neil Findlay, by referring to Aneurin Bevan, who said in 1946, and I quote, "No longer will wealth be an advantage nor poverty a disadvantage. Healthcare will be provided free of charge based on clinical need and not on an ability to pay." Those founding principles are as important today as they were then. As members will know, the Beveridge Report, published in 1942, identified disease as one of the 5 giant evils that had been plaguing society since the Victorian era and even earlier. And few people will argue that the foundation of the NHS as a cradle-to-grave service wasn't a fitting response to that report. Jackson Carlow has referred to the Conservatives and to Churchill and to their history in relation to the NHS. But it's my understanding in 1951, 6 years after the foundations were laid for the welfare state, the Conservative Party regained power and immediately set up a commission to review the NHS and the way it was funded through general taxation under an economist called Claude Guillebaud. The commission concluded that the NHS was a cost-effective, efficient way of delivering public health services, and a line was finally drawn at that point on the issue. But times change. The demands of the service increase, populations rise, and in Scotland, although we've only had a 6% increase in population from 1939, it's now continuing to rise steadily. People are, of course, living longer, but not necessarily longer in good health. And as the route map to 2020 Vision for Health and Social Care acknowledges, over the next 10 years, the proportion of over 75s who are the highest users of health and care services will increase by over 25%. That's why, apart from a desire to respond to patients' wishes, it's so important to move towards integrated health and social care. The increasing numbers with dementia presents a real challenge. The changing nature of healthcare, the drugs and techniques we use to treat patients, the changing nature of the care patients receive when they come into contact with the NHS. This inevitably means we can't stand still. We are constantly having to meet new challenges, and the NHS will come under even greater pressure in the years ahead. It will need to adapt. But we in Scotland are fortunate that our health service is largely devolved and that the current Scottish Government values and protects the founding principles of the NHS. That means scrapping That meant scrapping prescription charges, an issue which Labour members resigned over in the early 50s and did not send to cuts commissions to consider. And of course it means keeping under review measures to improve effectiveness. Since the SNP government took office, hidden waiting lists have been tackled, patients are being treated faster than ever before, and MRSA incidents have plummeted to the lowest level since records began. And look at the trend of positive healthcare. In just 1 decade, the incidence of coronary heart disease has fallen by 29%. And between 2007 and 2011, the mortality rate for under 75s with cancer has fallen by 6.6%. The purpose of the NHS must be to ensure everyone receives high-quality medical care whenever they need it, without ever having to worry about cost. In Scotland, we stick to that principle. Other parts of the UK are not so fortunate, and the growing consensus south of the border has for some time been a move towards privatisation of the health service, and indeed of charges for services. If someone needs a prescription in England today, it will cost them £7.85. For some, however few, that means a choice between treating their illness and putting food on the table. And of course, free personal care remains one of the great achievements of this Parliament. In difficult economic times, it's more important than ever to protect the services we value and rely upon as a society. And we need to maintain an NHS that adheres to its founding principles. But that doesn't mean it's perfect. Challenges continue to arise, and we need to respond. Yes, the ageing of nursing staff does mean that recruitment of nursing staff must be a priority, and that there is clearly a premium on experience. Yes, health is not all about physical health, it's also about mental health. In an age of austerity, joblessness will take its toll, and the comments of the Prince's Trust in their briefing make depressing reading. However, when it comes to providing a 24/7 service, I'm sure everyone in the Chamber will want to praise the staff of NHS 24, who handle 1.5 million calls from the Scottish public at all hours of the day every year. Clearly, we need to give some thought to how the consistency of services at different times can be improved. Of course, for example, we need to ensure that pharmacists and physios are able to provide 7-day care. Yes, we need to ensure we have enough A&E consultants, but we need also to ensure that attention is paid to alternatives to A&E. And we need to acknowledge the commitment and professionalism of ambulance crews, first responders, the fire and rescue service, A&E staff, surgeons, GPs, nurses, and each and every member of NHS frontline staff for their dedication in ensuring that Scotland has a health service which is accessible free of charge at any hour of the day or night, every day of the year. And in conclusion, Presiding Officer, when we reflect on the need for improvements, and there clearly is a need, we need to take into account, as the Cabinet Secretary has said, the very high levels of patient satisfaction across the NHS. 85% of patients reported that the service they received was good or excellent in Scottish Inpatient Service Survey in 2012. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I now call on Hugh Henry to be followed by Jim Eadie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to start by commending the contribution from Jackson Carlaw and also the comments made by Nanette Milne, because I think that those comments demonstrated that, irrespective of sometimes the aggression and the confrontation that we see in this chamber on a number of things, that as far as the National Health Service in Scotland is concerned, there is a consensus across all political parties that the NHS is a valued and valuable asset to each and every one of us in this country. And I would hope sometimes that we might have a debate about the National Health Service that actually reflected the fact that we're generally starting from the same starting point, that we have much in common rather than focus on all our differences. Now, I would have to say that when I saw the motion in the name of my colleague Neil Findlay, I was actually surprised, because I suspected that promotion to Labour's front bench had moderated his views and had tempered his natural enthusiasm to have a go and to have an argument. Because I actually think that his motion is perfectly reasonable. And for once, the Cabinet Secretary for Health shouts from a sedentary position, but in fact his response to Neil Findlay's contribution was all about Neil Findlay's motion. And I was deeply disappointed in that reaction, because I think there was much in what Neil Findlay has in his motion upon which
we could build, because it's not that the NHS is a basket case, and that wasn't what Neil Findlay suggested. There is much that we can be proud of that is happening in our NHS, much that happened since devolution under the previous Labour Lib Dem administration, and credit where it's due. There are a number of initiatives which have taken place under the SNP, which are still worthy of support, because we do know that that party has the NHS embedded in its views and in its philosophy. That's not what this debate is about. This debate is about, or should be about, a recognition that there are problems facing the NHS. And when we highlight and articulate the problems, and Roderick Campbell said in his contribution, there is a need for improvement, and we should all be big enough to recognise that when we express our concerns, the concerns that many of our constituents come to us with, our family members, the concerns indeed in which staff members of the NHS come to us with, then expressing those concerns is not a criticism of the NHS. It's not an attack or a condemnation of the staff in the NHS, but it's an aspiration to try to do something better, which is in the interest of each and every one of us, certainly.
Mark MacDonald.
I think the member is making a very measured and sensible contribution, but I wonder if I could ask him, NHS boards are reviewed annually. There is also a review of the NHS through Healthcare Improvement Scotland and through the Care Inspectorate of the wider care agenda. What does Mr Henry believe that the review that the Labour Party are calling for would add to that work that is ongoing presently?
Hugh Henry.
Well, I'm glad that in many respects there are continuing self-evaluation and improvement reviews of what is going on. But interestingly, despite what the Cabinet Secretary said to Neil Findlay, it's actually not just the Labour Party that is saying that. The chartered physiotherapists in Scotland said they recommended that there should be a baseline review. What do they mean? The RCN said that an entire system review of the NHS in Scotland, including staff and beds, needs to take place if we are to consider providing an extended hours NHS. Do you have difficulty in understanding that? Certainly.
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank the member for taking an intervention, and can I say I actually agree with the gist of what he's arguing.
Cabinet Secretary, I'm sorry, we can't hear you if you turn too far away.
I actually agree with the gist of what the member is arguing, and particularly in developing the detail of the 2020 vision, I am more than happy and very keen to share how we do that with the other parties in this chamber. Because I do recognise that there are other parties, we've heard Nanette Millen and Jackson Carlow and others today, with other ideas. So I make the offer to all the other parties in this chamber in mapping out the 2020 Vision and Action Plan. If they want to take that offer up, I will certainly abide by it.
Hugh Henry, you're in your last minute. I can only give you a few seconds.
Well, I'm glad to hear that offer from the Cabinet Secretary. But also I hope that he does go that bit further and agrees to work with all the parties in reviewing what is needed, and indeed the parties outside this Parliament, what is needed to review the health service, because there are fundamental problems. We know that no health board has met the outpatient guarantee on 12 weeks. We know that when I asked a question of the Cabinet Secretary in this Parliament about mortality rates at the REH, that on the day that I asked the question, suddenly a different set of figures to the ones produced for Ian McConaughey and highlighted by the Paisley Daily Express were produced by the NHS. Either there is incompetence in some of the information that is provided, or else there is manipulation of the statistics, and we need to look at that together, because this is not a criticism of the Cabinet Secretary, it's not a political point, it's the fact that under freedom of information, members of the public were being given and are being given wrong information. So, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I regret that I did lose some time because of the interventions that I took, but I do think there is much that we can agree on. I do think that we can work together. And I do hope that sometimes we could put aside all these point-scoring arguments and concentrate on what is needed, and a review would be a good place to start that.
Thank you very much. I have to say to the rest of the members in the debate that there really is no time, and interventions must be contained within your own speeches if you wish to take them. Jim Eady, to be followed by Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today's debate concerns the future of our National Health Service. But one of the issues with major ramifications for the operation and funding of the NHS is the Private Finance Initiative. Jackson Carlaw talked about a publicly funded, publicly owned NHS. In fact, even allowed the word collective to pass his lips, and Hugh Henry has just told us about a valued and valuable NHS. But my concern is that all of that can be undermined and is being undermined by PFI. In a report for the Centre for International Public Health Policy at the University of Edinburgh, written by Mark Hellawell and Professor Alison Pollock, they state PFI projects create a debt for the NHS which is far greater than the investment it provides. One of the earliest and most deeply flawed examples of a PFI contract anywhere in the UK is the operation of the contract at the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary. In this case, the debt is such that taxpayers in NHS Lothian will have paid Concert Healthcare for maintenance of the ERI just under £1.3 billion by 2028. This issue goes to the heart of a publicly run and publicly funded NHS. It matters because these inflated service charges, now running at £60 million a year in the case of the ERI, rob our health service, the staff who work in it and the patients who use its services of valuable resources. The Scottish Government, as we heard, has acted to protect health funding, passing on all of the Barnett consequentials since 2011 and increasing the health resource budget by 22%. However, the fact remains that there is less money available than there would have been as a direct consequence of PFI. And let us be clear, these are valuable resources which could be used to recruit and retain hard-working NHS staff, to provide high-quality patient care and to tackle the inequalities in life expectancy and health outcomes which exist in our most deprived communities. This is a matter which must concern every Lothian's MSP and on which we should have the maximum transparency, maximum scrutiny and a full parliamentary debate. The Edinburgh Evening News and its reporter Dan Sanderson is to be congratulated on their campaign to highlight the breaches of contract at the hospital. It was thanks to them that we learned of the totally inadequate levels of fines, which means the contractor can only be fined a maximum of £28.24 a day for serious failures in the maintenance contract. It was as a result of their investigation that we discovered a catalogue of failures which included a serious violation of hygiene standards, with flies being found in operating suites, leading to operations being cancelled, a failure in the power supply which led to some surgical operations being completed by torchlight, incomplete checks on staff, and the Healthcare Environment Inspectorate issuing criticism of hygiene deficiencies in wards and toilets. I'm deeply concerned at these serious breaches of contract, a concern which should be shared by every MSP and every party across this chamber. The Government's amendment refers to measures to support NHS boards to keep bed capacity requirements under regular review. There is widespread agreement that the NHS needs to transfer health services and resources from the acute hospital sector to community and primary care settings, a point that was made by Michael McMahon. However, a significant failure of the contract at the ERI was its inability to anticipate and plan for the number of beds which would be required at the new hospital. The British Medical Association, Unison and my respected colleague Margot MacDonald all warned of the shortage of beds as far back as 1999. These warnings were dismissed at the time, but the passage of time has vindicated their stance. A more recent source of concern in relation to bed numbers is the behaviour of Concert Healthcare. NHS Lothian was forced to agree to a no-penalty clause before agreement could be reached on the provision of a new ward with an extra 31 beds at the ERI. What this means in practice is that NHS Lothian is prevented from imposing any penalties, what are known as deficiency points, for breach of contract for a period of up to 5 years. I do not believe that such behaviour has any place in our modern NHS. I said at the time that Concert were guilty of financial blackmail and of an utterly scandalous attempt to hold NHS Lothian to ransom. And I see no evidence to suggest that I was wrong in that assertion. It is for all of these reasons that I have sought to achieve cross-party support for a debate on the abuse of power by Concert Healthcare at the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, by tabling a motion in July 2013. This was my second attempt to secure a debate, and on this occasion I received the support of SNP and independent colleagues, including Margot MacDonald, whose track record on this issue is second to none. I also received the backing of Unison and BMA Scotland. Presiding Officer, I wanted to work with colleagues in all parties to bring the maximum scrutiny to bear on the operation of this contract. I wanted to explore with the Scottish Government what further measures it could take to address the operation of this contract. And most of all, I wanted us to hold Balfour Beatty and Concert Healthcare to account for their actions. As parliamentarians, our first duty is to listen to reflect and to act upon the concerns of our constituents. And in my case, that means the people who use the ERI and the people who work there. The issue of PFI is a matter of huge public interest and on which there is growing and justifiable public anger. That public anger demands a united and concerted response from MSPs of all parties. It is time to put aside the political blame game, as Jackson Carlaw and Hugh Henry and others have said. And today I call on all of my Lothian MSP colleagues to heed that call, to act in the interests of our constituents and to back all future attempts to bring this vital issue before the Chamber and to allow these important issues to be discussed.
Thank you. I now call Kevin Stewart, to be followed by Margaret McCulloch.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. On each occasion when we have a debate about the National Health Service in Scotland, we inevitably think about the part that the NHS has played in dealing with the illnesses and ailments of our own loved ones, whether that's friends or family. And I have to say that I would pay tribute to all staff within the National Health Service in Scotland, whether that be from cleaners to consultants. I think that they are second to none. Now, as an MSP, like everyone else in this chamber, we often have folks coming to our doors, writing to us and phoning us about the failures that they have experienced. And I have to say that that is almost inevitable in a large organisation. But in most cases where I deal with cases, the NHS responds accordingly and tries to deal with any mistake that may have been made. And, you know, I often, in these occasions, think about how much different it would be for folks requiring treatment if they were in other places, in these islands, and also around the world. I think that we are extremely fortunate that we have a publicly funded and publicly delivered health service here in Scotland. And I'm glad to hear colleagues today saying that they feel that that is the right thing too. It's often that Mr Carlaw and I disagree on a number of points, but I think the Tory party here, north of the border, has shown a different way from that south of the border. Today, for example, we've seen Dr Jackie Davis of Keep Our NHS Public, south of the border, talking about privatisation in terms of certain day-to-day contracts. And she has said, this isn't privatisation by the back door, it's privatisation by the front door, and it is really putting patients' lives at risk. We are following a different path here. And I am proud that in the main, we agree on most of the points. And there are always going to be areas where we disagree on, but such is life. I think the key thing for me in looking at the challenges of the future, whether that be the challenges of austerity, which have not really hit our NHS here in Scotland as much as they could have, because this government has ring-fenced the NHS budget, the challenge of the costs of new treatments as they come along, and of course the major challenge of demographic change are things that we need to constantly keep under review. And that is why, you know, I am really pleased that this government has made strides in terms of health and social care integration. I realise that there's much work still to do, but that is the right way forward. I'm glad that we have had the review into workforce planning tools and also into bed planning tools, because I think that that is extremely important. Also, in terms of delivering that 7-day service that so many have talked about today, we have seen a £4 million investment to look at innovative approaches there, and that is the right thing there. And we also, of course, have the £50 million that has been put into the Unscheduled Care Action Plan. But I think, that we still need to look at budgets in particular and see that shift maybe a little quicker than at present of moving resource to primary care, because prevention is better than cure. And we have seen a number of initiatives by this government to ensure that prevention takes place. We have seen investment in telemedicine, free prescriptions, free eye tests, free personal care, as has already been mentioned by a number of folk in the chamber today. And we have seen initiatives like family nurse partnerships, which I think are making great gains out there. And colleagues have mentioned the policy which was passed last week to ensure free school meals for primary 1s, 2s and 3s. And some folk may think that this has got very little to do with health, but Satwat Rehman, Chief Executive of One Parent Families Scotland, has said the benefits of free school lunches are particularly important to children from low-income families, but poor diet and obesity affects children from all backgrounds. Healthy free school lunches have been shown to help tackle health inequalities, as well as reducing the poverty trap faced by parents trying to move into employment. And I think that these initiatives, in terms of prevention, are the way forward. Now, we have heard today that the Labour Party wants a wholesale review of the health service. I think that that is the wrong move. And I agree with others who have said here today that I would much rather see resources put into the front line rather than in an expensive review, which may very well come up with nothing. And finally, Presiding Officer, I cannot pay enough respect to those folks who work in our NHS here in Scotland.
Thank you very much. I call Margaret McCulloch to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I also apologise for my absence for part of the debate. Following the publication of the Health Improvement Scotland review into the safety and quality of care in NHS Lanarkshire, I took the view that three things should happen. Firstly, that there should be an ongoing independent scrutiny to make sure that the review panel's findings are implemented, and I understand that's happening. Secondly, that there should be a full parliamentary debate in the health service, such as the one Labour has secured today, to give members the opportunity to discuss the review and wider issues facing the NHS in Scotland. And thirdly, that the Scottish Government should support Labour's call for a full inquiry into the pressures on our NHS, because, as the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh have said, the problems in Lanarkshire will be familiar to clinicians all across the country. Today, I want to focus on how the experience of patients and staff in NHS Lanarkshire strengthens the case for the full and comprehensive review Labour called for in our motion. Mortality rates in Lanarkshire's 3 acute hospitals triggered the HIS inquiry, which reported at the end of last year. We now know that mortality rates at Hare, Myers and Wishaw are closer to the national average than first anticipated, but Monklands remains an outlier. However, the panel's findings across the 3 sites should give us all cause for serious concern. I am not aware of anyone in the Scottish Government disputing or contesting a single one of the findings of the HIS report. To the best of my knowledge, the Scottish Government has accepted the report in full and therefore accept the following: that there was a significant disconnect between what leadership team thought was actually happening in Lanarkshire and what was happening on the ground, that there was a lack of sustained delivery on the A&E, that there was an underreporting of risk, that there were examples of clinicians not escalating concerns about the safe provisions of care because they didn't think anything would change as a result, that there was a persistence of practices which represented an unacceptable risk to patient care, such as a lack of consultant cover, that the pressures of providing services across 3 acute sites were a recurrent theme, not least in respect of staffing and workforce recruitment, and that staff at all levels in NHS Lanarkshire believed unscheduled care was in a state of perpetual crisis. If the Government accept those findings, then surely people in Lanarkshire are entitled to ask how on earth our Government allowed such a grave situation to develop when the problems faced by this health board are so well documented. It shouldn't have taken a spike in mortality rates at Monklands Hospital or any other hospital for ministers to see that the pressure has been felt across the NHS would have been felt so acutely in Lanarkshire. Time and again, I have raised with the Government, the Health Board and Lanarkshire communities, the concerns that I have about pressure points on the health service, especially A&E. The HIS review panel states there is a growing evidence based on linking poor flow and suboptimal scheduling in healthcare to an increased mortality rate, adverse events, readmissions and poor financial performance. There is evidence that congestion in the accident emergency department and the hospital increases the risk of death for patients admitted to hospital. Last month, the Sunday Mail reported on the longest waiting times in A&E, waiting times over 12 hours, doubling across Scotland and trebling in Lanarkshire. NHS Lanarkshire and Scottish Government support team are looking at how to improve patient flow and hopefully address these long-standing issues. But we've been here before, and as the report makes clear, previous interventions to support NHS Lanarkshire to achieve the 4-hour standard have not resulted in sustained delivery. The Government just can't pass the buck to the board and A&E. There are questions to be asked about their own effectiveness. Whenever I raise my concerns about A&E crisis in Lanarkshire, the Health Secretary refers back to decisions taken 7 years ago to retain Monklands A&E. But what HIS have shown is that the Government have retained 3 in the A&E units in Lanarkshire without addressing any of the underlying issues which compelled the Health Board to consider moving to 2 A&E units in the first place. I'm just going to continue with this, if you don't mind. Minor injury units have been scrapped in Cumbernauld. New investment in Hairmyres and Wishaw was cancelled. And in medical staffing, review teams say the inescapable conclusion is that actions taken to date are inadequate. Presiding Officer, NHS Lanarkshire faces a series of grave, recurring challenges, but we cannot look at this health board in isolation. We have to look at decision-making and leadership in the health service at all levels, including the decisions that come from the top. That is why I believe a root and branch review is needed now, and that's why I support the Labour motion. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now call Mark MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I said in my intervention to Hugh Henry I thought he struck a very measured tone in the debate. I thought he was a little uncharitable about the intervention I gave to him, but I asked it in a genuine spirit of trying to understand where exactly it is that the Labour motion is coming from, because the term review does cover many options, and we've heard mentioned that we want a wholesale review, but we've heard mentioned that we want to look at baseline reviews in certain areas. So does it cover everything? Does it cover some things? Does it cut across other work that I highlighted in my intervention is being done, and therefore risk duplication of effort, particularly in terms of annual reviews that take place? And the reason we don't know is that no real terms of reference for this review or ideas of where this review would go and what it would lead to have been laid out. And I simply say that the Labour Party needs to work out whether or not it's trying to be an opposition party aspiring to government, or if it's trying to be a lobbying organisation. Because if it wants to be a party aspiring to government, then there's nothing wrong with coming to the chamber and articulating the concerns that are expressed by others. But at the moment, Presiding Officer, all we have at the moment is a skeleton that is absolutely bereft of the meat of policy intention from the Labour Party. And that's what we need to know, is what exactly does the Labour Party hope to get out of such a review, Mr Finlay?
Neil Finlay.
If the members supporting the call for review, then I would happily discuss the terms of reference with the Minister, and I'm sure he would take the members' input into that as well. But can I nail something on this? That we are reflecting the call from stakeholders from across the National Health Service, including a number who were at the Herald's Health Conference, who were calling for a major review of social care as well. So this is not just us saying this. This is people from across the NHS who are saying this.
Mark MacDonald.
Well, I think Mr Finlay, rather than nailing that, hit himself on the thumb, because what he needs to understand is I already made the point that I don't have a problem with people coming and articulating the concerns that expressed outside of this chamber. The point is that the Labour Party has to add to that by describing what its policy intentions would be in relation to such a review. But I'll come back to that perhaps at the end of my speech. Well, Mr Finlay, ever the dramatist. Now, I could cite, Presiding Officer, many improvements in NHS performance, as colleagues across the chamber have done, and I will highlight some later on. But I could also highlight areas where NHS has identified, or it has been identified by others, that there is need for improvement, and others have done that as well on these benches. I think the difficulty that I have with the way that this debate is framed, and I think that's why I was struck by the approach that Mr Henry took, is that too often from the opposition, when things are going well, we hear the cries of "you're being complacent." When things need to be improved, we hear the cries of "everything's in crisis." It tends not to be in either of those extremities. We understand entirely that there are always going to be areas that need to be improved in a human organisation like the National Health Service. With the volume of patients who are seen on a daily basis, sometimes things will go wrong, and we all get constituents coming to our surgeries who will tell us of individual circumstances which have not gone to the high standards that we would aspire to. And I think the very big danger that we fall into is where we take individual cases and try to describe them as the norm and what is happening elsewhere in the National Health Service. And that is not something that is recognised by the health professionals that I speak to when raising constituency concerns in my area. But I want to touch on an area, Presiding Officer, which has not been mentioned in the debate, and indeed doesn't seem to get mentioned a lot in health debates, and that's the area around dentistry. And it's an area where we can actually look at where the improvements have taken place since this government came to office. Now, I recall prior to the 2007 election, the queues round the block in the town of my birth, Inverurie, in the north-east of Scotland, and the long queues in many north-east communities to gain access to NHS dentistry. However, since 2006 across Scotland, we've seen a 32.6% increase in the number of GDS-registered dentists. That's 793 additional dentists since 2006. And what we've seen as a result of that is that the waiting lists for NHS dentistry in Grampian have plummeted. Absolutely plummeted. They are almost at zero in terms of the number of people waiting to access NHS dentistry. And that's through, whether that's through the additional NHS practices that have opened up in the City of Aberdeen. I could cite Dice in my constituency as having a new NHS patient-accepting dentistry in the community. But I suspect it's also down to the Aberdeen Dental School, which was opened in 2008, I believe it was 2009, sorry, by this SNP government. Now, I recall at the time the Liberal Democrats doubted the potential of that facility to eradicate dental waiting lists in the NHS Grampian area. Mike Rumble said it wouldn't remove the waiting list problems. Can I say it didn't? It's not just NHS dental waiting lists that have virtually been eradicated in the north-east of Scotland. It's also the Liberal Democrats, Presiding Officer, since that bold statement was made by Mike Rumbles. But as always with the NHS, Presiding Officer, it is about choices, and it's about parties laying out the choices that we make. And this government, in every budget, lays out the choices it is making in terms of the National Health Service. And every health committee where the budget is discussed, my colleagues will know I raised the question of disinvestment versus additional investment, and I raised that to Mr Findlay in his speech, and Mr Findlay said that that's what he wants the review for. He wants a review to tell him how the NHS money should be spent, and I can just say to Mr Findlay that if he wants to be the next Health Secretary, he needs to stop leaving it to other people to do his homework for him.
Thank you very much. We now turn to closing speeches, and I call on Jim Hume. Maximum 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. We've had a robust debate this afternoon on a subject that's clearly dear to the heart of us all. I'm grateful for Neil Findlay for bringing forward a debate on the NHS, but regret that I felt there was little in the motion that provided many ideas, and of course I would also rather pay for frontline nurses than expensive inquiries that may take some time. I concentrated in my remarks on several issues that I believe need addressed, and I did so constructively, in particular noting the disparity in treatment times for cancer and staffing vacancies, problems for staff regarding overworking and stress, and, of course, waiting times for A&E. We know there are specific problems in certain areas, such as NHS gramping, but simply isn't good enough to blame retirals and relocations. These do not happen overnight and will be little consolation to the 20% of colorectal and 50% of head and neck cancer patients waiting longer than the 62 days. But they are not alone in terms of urological cancer. Of course, 25% of patients in Lanarkshire, 17% in Dumfries and Galley, 15% in Fife, all waiting over the 62-day target. And in addition to the excessive waiting times for head and neck cancer treatment in Grampian, 12.5% of patients in NHS Highland, over 41% in Ayrshire and Arran are all waiting over those 62 days. Jim Eadie made an interesting intervention on myself regarding if I welcomed an increase in numbers of students. If he'd actually read the last line of my amendment, it says, I welcome the increase in the number of nursing and midwifery students beginning the training in autumn 2014. He also brought in the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary and calling on working with fellow Lothians MSPs. Many constituents from South Scotland, which includes East Lothian, use the ERI also. So I'd be happy to work constructively with Jim on that, Jim Eadie on that subject later past this debate. The Cabinet Secretary was referring to patients, being treated faster than ever before in his amendment, and there's no doubt that some good work has been done, and I don't deny that, but there are particular problems in certain areas for all cancer sufferers, such as NHS Grampian, and I know there it's impacted upon patients in Orkney and Shetland too, as well as specific problems with urological and head and neck cancers, which must of course be explained by the Cabinet Secretary or perhaps the Minister. The figures in certain areas are appalling, and Detect Cancer Early initiatives, record-breaking treatment times and patient safety programmes won't mean anything to cancer patients waiting day after day for that phone call or letter to say their radiotherapy or chemotherapy is finally about to start. Concerns also persist over our emergency departments after many were plunged into crisis last year. We hope that the staff have an easier time of it this year, but nationally compliance has again fallen, with 9 of our 14 health authorities failing to achieve the 4-hour target in the 3 months up to September, before all the pressure that winter brings had become a factor. Again, the Cabinet Secretary's assertion that patients are being treated faster than ever before doesn't really stand up to scrutiny. In the first full year of the SNP government, there were just 7,385 patients who failed to be treated and discharged within 4 hours between the July and September of that year. The corresponding figure has almost trebled last year to just over 20,000. And those stats don't tell us how many waited 6, 8 or even 12 hours on a trolley to be treated. Time will tell whether the Cabinet Secretary's Unscheduled Care Action Plan will be a success. I hope that it is. But will 18 consultants be enough to drive back a threefold increase in the numbers of people failing to be treated within 4 hours? I regret that I will be unable to support the Cabinet Secretary's amendment today. I nearly did, but it glosses over all the legitimate concerns I have raised in the debate and the stats I have highlighted regarding cancer treatment and A&E waiting times, all of which are readily available on the ISD Scotland website. I am also happy to take up the Cabinet Secretary in his absence offer up to work together regarding the 2020 vision for our NHS, and I appreciate his constructiveness there. There are challenging times for the NHS, particularly as the consensus rightly seems to be towards making a truly 24/7 service for the 21st century with a person-centred approach, but this will require resources and adequate staffing, something which doesn't exist in many areas. Presiding Officer, our NHS is our nation's most loved and valued service. We have challenges as we go forward. A further challenge in recruitment and staffing on top of the challenges I highlighted in my opening remarks. We do need to address disparity in waiting times and the cancer treatment times. Addressing the shortage in cancer specialists should go a long way to help. As said, I was nearly compelled to support the Government motion, as I do commend NHS Scotland's staff commitments, professionalism and dedication as being key to patients, but I do believe it glossed over the serious issues. And as I said, I don't agree that we should be spending resource and waste time on full and comprehensive reviews when much of the NHS does work quite well, and that what we need to concentrate on is review the parts that need improving and act upon those timelessly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Jackson Carlaw. 6 minutes, please.
Presiding officer, never on any cold Wednesday on any previous wet January afternoon can the charms of Cowdenbeath have proved more compelling or distracting. We started this afternoon's debate with Mr Finlay saying that even Jackson Carlaw cannot support the reforms in the health service in England, and the thought occurred to me, any more than Mr Finlay could support the reforms of the Blair government in the previous 15 years, because of course the Labour government that led the devolved Parliament didn't introduce or follow those reforms here in Scotland. And I was very taken with the Cabinet Secretary in a number of ways this afternoon, but he did make reference to the ring-fencing of health spending and the consequentials in Scotland. And I do at times wonder how much more has been spent over and above the consequentials that have been obtained from Westminster. And I'll facilitate the Cabinet Secretary answering that by tabling a written question, just so that we can fully understand that dynamic. Jim Hume said that the Cabinet Secretary was kept up at night. I can only observe that at his venerable age, many and varied are the possible reasons for this. Indeed, for him missing Mr Hume's closing speech. But the ageing demographic and concerns of the RCN, I agree, ought to be one worthy explanation. Michael McMahon illustrated that there are no shortage of people who can regale us with the problems in Scotland's NHS. And whatever reports existed a decade ago, and the Kerr report was one, I don't think myself that it actually offered the correct model to go forward, and I accept it's very difficult for any report to achieve that. But if we are going to go forward, it would be better if it were with a greater degree of unanimity. But one of the things I think that it didn't anticipate effectively a decade ago was the ageing demographic. Scottish Conservatives today have revealed that in terms of emergency admissions to hospital, in 2003, of those aged over 75, in 2003 these were 116,000. And last year were 149, nearly 150,000. And I think that just is a further illustration of the enormous change and challenge that the ageing demographic represents to Scotland. I was struck by Kevin Stewart's contribution this afternoon, and I reflected, of course he's absolutely right, if every patient who was treated by the NHS came to MSPs dissatisfied with the service they had received, we would do nothing other than deal with them. But in fact, it is still the exception rather than the rule when somebody suffers the shortcomings of the service. And while we should be fearless in rooting them out, resolving and learning from them, we should recognise that the job that is done by the overwhelming majority of those who work in the NHS, a point appreciated on all sides of the chamber, is the very best and the most admirable that we could wish or hope for. I was slightly saddened by Gil Patterson's contribution this afternoon. I hold Mr Patterson in some regard, but simply perpetuating the tribal argument fails to serve. To rattle on about the privatisation, if that's what it is, of the health service in England is as irrelevant, frankly, as the status of the health service in Australia. This matter is devolved. It's devolved so that... Yeah?
Mark MacDonald.
But the member must accept that there is a link in terms of Barnett consequentials, and any consequential reduction in health spending south of the border would impact on the health budget of this Parliament. So it's not entirely divorced. I accept it's not completely linked, but there is still a link there.
Mr MacDonald, I hope, will acknowledge that health spending in England has been ring-fenced, and it is a result of that that huge consequentials have come to the Scottish Parliament to spend in its devolved decision-making basis. So I think he can have no complaint. Roderick Campbell again expanded in the English example. And what was the purpose of devolution, were it not to allow us to evolve our own health priorities in line with our experience? No party in this chamber is advocating either the Labour, Liberal or Conservative model of health care in England. The Scottish Labour Party, the Scottish Liberal Democrats, the Scottish Conservatives, the Scottish National Party have a distinct policy in health appropriate to the health service in Scotland.
Gil Patterson.
I appreciate you taking the intervention. The point that I was making has nothing to do with English Health Service, about the Labour Party and their calls for a unified system across the United Kingdom, and that's what scares me to death.
Order. Jackson Carlaw.
I turn instead, I think, to Hugh Henry, and I thank him for his appreciation of both mine and Annette Milne's contributions, and for his understanding and appreciation of what I hope was the substantive point I made. Scottish Conservatives stand with Scotland's NHS and not with England's. And my appreciation of his contribution went far beyond that, though, because I applaud his understanding that asking questions about the future of the NHS in Scotland is our duty and not a criticism of everything that we are seeking to do. And that led in turn, I thought, to an interlude of reason in this afternoon's debate, and I very much welcome then the Cabinet Secretary's offer to have the kind of mapping out discussion that is required. I welcome this. I'm prepared to believe him because it is my experience of him to date that he means what he says. And so we very much welcome the opportunity to participate in that discussion. Presiding Officer, I said at one point in the debate, was it futile to expect that we can move our imaginations, enmities and ambitions beyond the sterile name-calling between the various parties in the chamber? For a significant part of this afternoon's debate, and I suppose probably in debates again in the future, I will wonder if that's possible. But for a few moments this afternoon, I believe that perhaps it is.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Michael Matheson to, with 8 minutes, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As ever, when it comes to health debates in this chamber, they always prove to be very interesting. There have been a number of what I thought were very measured and very constructive contributions. Jackson Carlaw, Aileen MacLeod, Annette Milne and Hugh Henry, and their contributions I all thought made a very considered intervention in this particular debate on how they see things moving forward within the NHS in Scotland in the years to come. I think Jackson Carlaw got us off to a good start, can we say, when he outlined the shared value that we all have around our NHS, why every one of us recognise its value and importance it has within our own society. And a big part of that is probably because it's a public service that we all make use of. We have all made use of it at some point and we've all benefited from it at some point. It's also the service that we hope will put things right when our health does go wrong, when we lose that bit of control over our life because we're unwell with some condition or another, that the NHS is the very body and its staff are the ones who will help to give us that control back. And I think for those very practical reasons and those very personal reasons, it's why it's an issue that cuts across political boundaries and why we all value our NHS so much and the contributions it makes to our society. So it follows that it's only right that we all have a vested interest in making sure that we have the best possible NHS we can, that we have an NHS that is a world leader, that is able to deliver the best standard of health care for every citizen as and when they require it. And that's why it's important we all have that shared value and our health debate is informed by that shared value. Of course, there will be times when I expect parties to disagree on the approach that has been taken by a particular government at a particular point on how it seeks to achieve the best possible health service. But underlying that, I think as Hugh Henry made as well, we have that underlying shared agenda of trying to achieve the best possible healthcare system we can in our society. And I think Jim Hume, in his contribution, as others did, recognised the fantastic work. The vast majority of what that goes on in our NHS is fantastic. And we are rightly very, very proud of our staff within NHS and what they achieve. And it's also a reality, and I don't say this for political ends, our NHS is better today than it was 5 years ago, or when it was 10 years ago, or when it was 15 or 20 years ago. Our NHS continues to evolve, and we have a better NHS today than we had several years ago. Just to give you some facts around this matter, during the quarter ending September 2013, 98.3% of patients were treated within the 12-week legal treatment time guarantee. That compares to 85% of inpatient day cases which were seen within 18 weeks in the quarter ending March 2007. And at September 2013, 95.4% of patients waited less than 12 weeks standard for the first outpatient consultation which compares to 84.2% back in March 2007. That in itself, those statistics just demonstrate the progress that has been made within our NHS. Some of it is because of policy in directing it, set by government and delivered by NHS boards. Some of it is also because of science, in the way in which our NHS has moved on and the types of diagnostic programmes that we now have. But while these improvements are taking place as our NHS evolves and develops over the years, we also have to face up to the challenges which our NHS face, that the Cabinet Secretary set out in his own contribution, and in particular the challenges which we face as a result of the demographic challenge that we have as a society, with an ageing population, with people living longer, which is great, but as they live longer, they're more likely to have a number of long-term conditions, and how that then impacts on how we design and deliver our NHS. And just to pick up on a couple of the points that members have made during the course of the debate about the changes that are taking place to meet some of this challenge. Neil Findlay raised the issue around 7-day working within our NHS. He challenged us on the progress we're making in that matter because of the lack of staff that we have across a range of disciplines within our NHS. However, a bit of research, Mr Findlay, would have helped you to understand that we have started that process, and that's why we have established a task force to help to identify what staffing levels we need to put in place in order to make sure we can deliver services on a 7-day-week basis. So it's not a point of criticising where we're at just now, it's about where we're trying to get to and the measures we're now taking in order to achieve that. And if Mr Findlay had maybe given further consideration to it, he may have realised that and understood that more fully. Another point that was raised by several members was around the issue of delayed discharges. Delayed discharges have been a long-standing problem within our NHS and the linkage between our health and social care system. Just a week or so ago, I was down in Ayrshire at Crosshouse, meeting with the staff within the frail elderly unit, talking to them about some of the challenges that they are having and that they are facing. And delayed discharges were one of the major problems they faced as a result of it obstructing the patient pathway and being able to get a patient discharged. We recognise that's an issue. That's why there's a range of measures we have taken in order to try and address that, and that's why we're integrating health and social care in order to make sure we deal with that much more effectively. We recognise we need to make sure the back door in our hospitals is as big as the front door in our hospitals to make sure we can get patients moving through the system much more effectively. And I'll give way to Mr Findlay on that point.
Neil Findlay.
Isn't it the case, though, that a social care system that's based on driving contracts, terms and conditions and standards down cannot meet the demands that are being placed upon it?
Minister.
The challenge when I was in Ayrshire was around the way in which the councils are operating, and it's the failure to have the proper linkage between them and staff working in partnership. That's what the staff are telling me, the frontline staff, and what their experience is on a day-in, day-out basis, and that's why we have to get it much more effective. And when Mr Findlay also raised the issue about how can we make sure that we are delivering the right services, where in a board at NHS Lothian there are something like only 25 doctors on at the weekend. Utter nonsense. You could hardly staff an A&E department. We'd sit down with 25 doctors over a course of a weekend. Again, another example of misleading information which does not help this debate. That's why it's important, if we are going to make sure we continue to make progress in our NHS,
Minister,
we do so.
I have to ask you to resume your seat. I have a point of order from Mr Findlay. Order, please.
On the point of order, Presiding Officer, just to clarify, it is NHS Lothian themselves who have provided the information that the Minister refers to.
It's not a point of order, Minister.
Well, not only is it not a point of order, it's also a load of baloney, Mr Findlay. Because
Minister, could we stick to parliamentary language, please?
The facts will prove that there's not 25 doctors on an NHS Lothian across the course of a weekend. Presiding Officer,
Minister, you must conclude.
What's important here, Presiding Officer, is we don't get sucked into this idea of an Ayrshire through some type of review that will take us to a Neverland, which is basically a fig leaf for a party who have absolutely nothing to contribute about how we take our NHS forward in the years to come. What we need to do is go over the actions that we've already put in place to make sure that we deliver an NHS that's fit for its purpose, that we have a vision for the future, and we have got that. And as a government, we are prepared to work with others who have got some serious ideas about how we can make sure our NHS continues to evolve to be a world-leading NHS in the world.
Thank you. Now calling Rhoda Grant to wind up the debate. You have until 4:59.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As many of the speakers today have pointed out, the NHS is valued not only by all our constituents, but by all the parties in this Parliament. It's indeed a national treasure. It needs to be protected and grown. And it needs to be allowed to grow to meet the needs of our communities into the future. Many speakers mentioned, Michael McMahon, Roderick Campbell, Nanette Milne mentioned the change in demographics to an ageing population. The complex health conditions of many of those ageing populations that we need to deal with and the NHS has to work with. Not to mention things like dementia, which we haven't dealt with at all in this debate. Therefore, the NHS needs to develop and change to meet these needs, and that is why we brought this debate to the Parliament today. We brought the concerns of dedicated NHS staff to the Chamber in the hope that the Cabinet Secretary would listen to them. I was disappointed, like Hugh Henry, that many of the SNP backbenchers, instead of giving voice to concerns of their constituents, actually were apologists for the government. And that was not our wish for the debate. It was actually to bring forward real concerns from the people who use and work in our NHS. So therefore, it's clear to me from this afternoon's debate that the SNP has no vision for the health service other than crisis management, which has been pointed out by some of the comments we have brought to the Chamber. Indeed, Scotland's Auditor-General has put the NHS on financial amber warnings last year and has signalled similar concerns this year about long-term financial planning. That is not us saying it, it is the Auditor-General. Michael McMahon pointed out that the Scottish Government failed to recognise, and I think Mark MacDonald may think he has all the answers, but I think it would do him good to listen to the experts in this field instead of pretending he knows what to do. Ignore the rest. Don't allow them to be part of a review. Mark MacDonald knows it all. Michael McMahon pointed out that the Scottish Government failed to recognise the impact.
Mr MacDonald, the member's not giving way.
The Scottish Government failed to recognise the impact of slashing things like local government budgets, which has halted the shift of the balance of care in its tracks. Cuts to community-based services are putting pressure on the NHS because of unscheduled admissions and also delayed discharges. Things that the Minister, Michael Matheson, mentioned in his own speech are big problems to the NHS in Scotland. And indeed, after years of rhetoric, health inequalities in Scotland remain Scotland's shame, but yet we are presided over by a government who has slashed anti-poverty funding and failed to recognise,
Mr Stewart, the member is not giving way.
Has failed to recognise that poverty is the greatest driver of health inequalities in our nation. They need to listen to those warnings. And we, along with the RCN, the BMA and indeed many others, believe that there needs to be a comprehensive review of the NHS to identify where those pressure points are, and that to enable us, and this is what we wish to do, to enable us to deliver an NHS that is fit for the 21st century. And on that basis, we're delighted to accept the Cabinet Secretary's offer of involvement in developing a 2020 vision. We were more than happy to work with the Government, as we were when we made an offer to work with them on GP contracts. I very much hope that this offer will actually come into fruition, unlike the one on GP contracts. We all acknowledge that staff are our biggest and best resource in the NHS, and dedicated and skilled people are working to keep the NHS going. And some of them are actually doing that at their own time, unpaid. There are more than 1,000 fewer nurses and midwifery staff than there were 4 years ago. And that puts a strain on our NHS staff. Between 2011 and 2013, the spend on agency staff and nurses and midwives has increased by 62%, showing that there is a desperate need for staff. And the RCN tell us that this puts significant pressure on the workers that are there. 58% of nurses saying they are under too much pressure. And indeed, some of our FOI responses have talked about huge numbers of staff being off work because of stress. And this is because they are working under far too much pressure, working unpaid hours over their contractual hours to actually keep the system going. The system is creaking and we need to listen to those people who are working it. We've also seen cuts of trainee places by 20%. And yes, people have come together and welcomed a 4% increase, but cut against a 20% decrease in the past. We need to do more. We also need to take into account, as Jackson Carlo said, the demographic profile of the nurses that are working in the NHS, because we are going to need many more in training in the future to fill that gap. There's also a gap in consultant vacancies. I think it was Jim Hume that quoted the numbers. But we are also told by the BMA that this isn't a short-term problem, as figures show difficulties in filling training posts in some specialities, and this is not sustainable. It's the BMA that are saying this is not sustainable. They are also telling us that medical staff are working over and above what's expected of them. They're feeling under considerable strain as a result. And again, it is clearly not sustainable. And again, we have seen the situation with junior doctors. We need to tackle this now. And we're asking in this debate that the Cabinet Secretary take seriously our plea to take this, to look at a review into this situation, to make sure that we tackle those problems. And we've seen very sadly in NHS Lanarkshire, and I think Margaret McCulloch spoke very eloquently on that, that it was mortality rates that actually raised alarm bells with the Cabinet Secretary for him to go and examine that. But the Royal College of Physicians tell us the finding of the review make depressing but not surprising reading. Clinicians across Scotland will recognise the challenges facing colleagues in Lanarkshire. So this is not on its own a problem for Lanarkshire, it's a problem for the whole of Scotland, and the Cabinet Secretary is again ignoring it. And I would appeal to him to look at a review even based on that information. They're also feeling...
One moment, Ms Grant. Can members who have just come into the chamber or members who have been here for a while stop the chattering and let Ms Grant finish her speech?
Turning to A&E, latest figures show that 9 health boards are failing to meet their A&E targets, and the SNP hasn't met its A&E targets for Scotland as a whole for 4 years. Even Bob Doris conceded that the weekend service was basically an emergency service, but this is failing. And Jane Baxter, I think, very sadly pointed out the problems in the Victoria Hospital, which doesn't even provide an emergency service at weekends, where patients need to travel to Dundee in the case of an emergency. And I don't think this is sustainable. Obviously, emergencies need to reach treatment as quickly as possible, and those problems are not unique to that area. The NHS is under financial pressures because of changes to care and indeed the way care is delivered. That will create financial pressures, and the Auditor General has pointed that out to us, and some members within the debate have raised that. I sincerely hope that the Cabinet Secretary is listening to those concerns. The Cabinet Secretary also talked about C. diff and infection control. I would have to say that I am concerned about the numbers because I don't believe they are realistic, and I would ask that he look into whether C. diff is being investigated properly. I have reason to suspect it's not from a local outbreak that had happened in the Highlands, and I am concerned that this would be happening elsewhere in the country as well. Presiding Officer, health spending is really a barometer of the nation's well-being. You can't leave people in poverty and out of work and poor housing dependent on food banks for nutrition and not expect all of that to impact on the NHS. The government have been so taken up with tearing our country apart that they've stopped doing their job. The money they spent on a white paper promising childcare in Never Never Land should have actually been spent on providing it now. They have put Scotland in pause, spent our money on dreams while our services are suffering and the health of the nation is in jeopardy because of that. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, can I just quote Teresa Fife from the RCN? It is not sustainable to manage the health service in this way, as shown all too clearly by missed waiting time targets, growing vacancy rates for nurses and other healthcare staff, and an increasing reliance on bank and agency staff, as well as private healthcare. The Cabinet Secretary needs to listen to those concerns. He cannot continue ignoring staff and, who are actually buckling under the strain of his mismanagement. If he doesn't, then we will face the consequences of that, and that's why we in the Labour Party are calling today for an honest and comprehensive review of the NHS in Scotland.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on the NHS in Scotland. We now move to the next item of business, which is the consideration of a business motion 8760 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a revision to the business programme for tomorrow, Thursday the 16th of January. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 8760.
Moved.
No members asked to speak against the motion, therefore I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 8760 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 8759 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the request speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 8759.
Moved.
No members asked to speak against the motion, therefore I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 8759 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. There are 3 questions to be put as a result of today's business. Can I remind members that in relation to the debate on the NHS, if the amendment in the name of Alex Neil is agreed, the amendment in the name of Jim Hume falls. So the first question is that amendment number 8752.3 in the name of Alex Neil, which seeks to amend motion number 8752 in the name of Neil Findlay on the NHS in Scotland, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote, amendment number 8752.3 in the name of Alex Neil is as follows. Yes, 64. No, 38. There were 11 abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed to, and the amendment in the name of Jim Hume falls. The next question is that motion number 8752 in the name of Neil Findlay as amended on the NHS in Scotland be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 8752 in the name of Neil Findlay as amended is as follows. Yes, 76. No, 38. There were no abstentions, so the motion as amended is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who are leaving the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.